Tassel or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.
Hi everyone, Stephen Van Tassel here, wildlife control consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Glad to have you on board. I hope your week and days are going well as we're trying to finish out the summer here. Some of you are going to have children going back to school, so that may be a blessing or a curse, depending, I guess, on your situation. So hopefully they'll do well. And I do hope you're being safe and you're trying to stay cool. Probably a lot of you are into bats at this point because I'm recording on August 17th. So things are probably moving pretty aggressively for some of you out in the field. Couple things. Do subscribe to the channel. We would appreciate that. Give us a 5-star review. Would be grateful. Of course, also join us on our Facebook page. Join the revolution, as Franklin calls it. We have had some challenges with getting some material up on YouTube, but nevertheless, understand that I'm always posting my podcast up on Rumble. So if you can't find it on YouTube, do join me over at Rumble. All you're going to do is look up Wildlife Control Consultant at Wildlife Control Consultant, and my channel will show up. If you're looking to reach me, definitely reach me at Wildlife Control Consultant at gmail.com. I'll get that straight. Wildlife Control Consultant at gmail.com. Perhaps you have suggestions for shows. Perhaps you have a criticism or a topic that you'd like to have covered. Perhaps you want to be on the show. We're always looking for guest speakers. It's been sort of interesting to me. I've mentioned this multiple times, how difficult it is to get people onto the show. So I'm not exactly sure why that is, but nevertheless, we're grateful for those who braved the fear to come onto the show. We'd be glad to have them, because I think I want to have a diverse audience, and I don't know everything. And I do think it's interesting to see the different perspectives and ideas and equipment and tools and ways of doing business and marketing. I think we have a very diverse field, and not one size fits all. There are fundamental principles in our industry that, of course, that everyone needs to follow, but how that is expressed and concretely in your particular area is going to be different, because your architecture is different, your wildlife is different, your laws are different, and even your own personality, what your goals are going to be different. So we can certainly explore that, and I think that we can learn from one another about how other people do things, about various tools, and I think that can help enrich us all. Certainly I've been enriched, and I hope you have as well. Well, you can see my website here. I'm sort of spotlighting one of my books, the Wildlife Removal Handbook. You know how I encourage everyone in the wildlife control field. You should be spending a certain amount of your time always reading something new. I know that a lot of people in this industry are not readers, but you need to read. You always need to be looking at something new, and I'm certainly going to suggest my book. You may say, oh, this is all too basic. Well, one thing that one famous football coach did when his team lost, he brought them all back into the clubhouse, and he offered them, he says, we're going to start with the fundamentals. Pulled out a football and told them, this is a football. Now that obviously may seem a bit rude, but even going over the fundamentals and basics, and by the way, this book isn't all fundamentals, but certainly it covers some core things. Perhaps you're looking to bring on a new technician, and so this could certainly be something that could help speed your training process. And then what about if you have a situation where you're looking to hire a secretary? It may be helpful for them to understand what's out in what your job is. Now, you can do either a ride along, that may not always be practical or wise, particularly if you're dealing with someone of the opposite sex. That may be difficult for you, for those of you that are married, but also it may not be wise. Of course, you can have them this is a way for them to read and just get a sense of what you're having to confront out in the field, because the more they understand about what you do and what you don't do, it's going to help them sell and take phone calls better over time. All right, enough about me. What am I going to talk about today? Today I wanted to talk about PowerPoints. Now, some of you are involved in training. As you know, I am certainly involved in a lot of training. So I wanted to kind of get this out there and to talk about how you need to be sure that your PowerPoints don't suck. One of the challenges in PowerPoint work is, of course, it takes a little bit of experience to get familiar with the software. PowerPoints are very powerful, but they can also be the kiss of death. And we have a phrase, death by PowerPoint. Now, I'm involved in my day job and, of course, in my podcast here. I'm involved in a tremendous amount of training, both on my daily day job professional setting, where I'm training people who are involved in pesticide renewal credits, as well as in other situations where there are no pesticide renewal credits. So I spend an incredible amount of time packaging my PowerPoints to try to encourage and aid in learning. So the PowerPoint is not a replacement for a good instruction. It is to enhance and support good instruction. If you have a bad PowerPoint, it actually detracts from your message and can actually encourage confusion among your audience. And so I wanted to kind of give you some fundamental principles to think about if you're looking to create a PowerPoint. Perhaps you've been asked to speak at a local group, perhaps a school, explaining what your job is. There may be times when you need to give a presentation, maybe to an HOA, some sort of a community, a designed community perhaps, where they have certain rules so that they may have some familiarity with the process that you're going to use to manage the wildlife damage that community is suffering. Perhaps you need to provide some education in a college setting. You may be a guest speaker. There's a whole host of things that you may do. Maybe you need to create a PowerPoint series that you're just going to have in a loop on a computer when you're going to a lawn and garden show or an expo to try to help market your business. The principles here are going to apply to all of those situations because they're foundational. And so I want to just kind of go over this relatively briefly to kind of give you some tips so that you don't make your PowerPoint presentations suck, okay, to be quite blunt about it. Here's the problem. Cell phones are killing us. Now, I'm not telling you to get rid of your cell phone. Here's mine. I use a cell phone, to be sure. It can be an extraordinarily powerful tool. You know that I've done a podcast on how to even use your cell phone better to take photographs, right? One of my pet peeves is wildlife control operators don't take enough photographs. But I digress. I'll let you go back and visit that particular that podcast that I had. But cell phones are becoming a major problem because they're actually rewiring our brain. In other words, they're changing the way that we gather information, and it's causing us not only to be distracted. I mean, how often have you been to a conference or a presentation, and no matter how many times someone mentions turn off your phone or silence your phone, there's always someone in the audience, depending on how large it is, someone's phone is unmuted, is unmuted, right? So there is something about this particular device that we just don't think about it enough in the sense of when we needed to turn it off so it's not causing noise and distraction for others. There is actually a phrase now in the academic literature called nomophobia. That's N-O-M-O phobia. Nomophobia. I just learned about it today. I was doing a little bit of research, trying to get some footnotes into my presentation today. And it said nomophobia. And what is nomophobia? The fear of being away from your cell phone, that people undergo anxiety when they don't have their cell phone, which is amazing. We have a new word for that now. So the cell phone is a major point of distraction. They find that it also kills our memory. And that is, people that are using their cell phone do worse in areas where they have to have memory recollection, because I think part of that is that it becomes a crutch. How many people can't even remember their own phone number anymore, right? Because I'll just text it to you. It's in my phone. So this is certainly a problem that's occurring. And whether we're angry about this or whether we're not angry about this, it's not my point. My point is that we have to understand the limitations of our audience in order to effectively package the information that we're going to give them so that there can be learning. If they don't understand it, if they don't perceive it, they can't learn it. And we're trying to take the knowledge that we have and transmit it to them. Because there's so much data overload. Cell phones are causing data overload, as well as the internet, all that, because we have all this information and power is right here. So this is something that we have to be thinking about. That is, we have distractions in our audience. Our audience doesn't remember anything, partly because they don't think they have to remember anything. I'll just Google it. It's one of my pet peeves is that everyone thinks, like when I'm looking on Facebook and people are asking questions, and that's certainly a good place to be to ask questions. You can do that on Pest Geek Podcast, and I'm not necessarily saying that that's such a negative thing you should never do it. No, I'm not saying that. My problem is that people think that they can get every question answered that way. That all it takes is just, what about this? And they can get this perfect answer. And that is just too simplistic. And that sometimes we are not thinking bigger about our problems, about where we're looking at the design of our companies, where we're looking at how are we marketing. We just think that we can get these cookie cutter answers in 3 sentences and we're good. And I can tell you that is simply not the case for some things. You're not going to be able to, what is the safest pesticide? There's no answer to that. You're not going to be able to Google that and say, what's the safest? Because safe in terms of what? Right? So we lose context and we lose perspective because we think that we can get everything in 3 sentences or less. And also our attention spans are short. And that is when we're doing a presentation, we have to recognize that our audience, are they able to focus long enough to follow an argument? In terms of my other work, some of you know that I'm a theologian. I certainly am I'm an editor for a theological and political journal. And one of the things that we're struggling with is that, in terms of my own ministry and talking to people, is how difficult it is for people to follow an argument. I mean, look at our political discourse today. You can't have an argument. All you have is people screaming at each other. We don't even agree on what the facts are. It's like if you point a problem out for someone else, what's the response? Well, you're an idiot. That's not an argument. We can't even follow. I'll ask questions. I just did one recently on Facebook where I was asking a person several questions and there's no response. Right? And I wasn't just trying to troll him. I was like, I had a little bit of trolling because I think he was being disingenuous in some of the comments that he made. But nevertheless, the questions were real and they were against someone that I actually supported. Right? Not that I loved them, but I was certainly pleasantly surprised by this particular politician, right? Doesn't mean I'm endorsing everything he did. A lot of things I disagreed with him, but I was actually, my expectations were so low, they were actually superseded. And I think that a lot of people have been unfair to him. But nevertheless, whether he agreed with that or not, he made a comment and blamed him for certain things in that particular political sphere that I thought was a little unfair and a little disingenuous. So I raised questions, but people can't engage at those levels. Now, maybe he'll respond eventually. Maybe he just got distracted or needed more time. I don't know. But I've had this problem regularly with people where they cannot, whenever you provide data for a position or you point out that the perspective is skewed, they cannot process it. They just simply shut down. That's a problem. And that is certainly something we're going to struggle with. And you may have that encounter in your own work when you're doing a presentation on wildlife control. You may have people in the audience, they're like, I don't believe we should ever kill animals. Well, is that really reasonable? Not even some of the groups that we would think as animal rights, although some of them are actually animal protectionists rather than animal rights, they don't even get to that point, right? They're just so strong. You have to have tremendous reasons to kill an animal, but they do believe there are times to kill an animal, right? So this is where our problem is. And so you need to recognize this is the challenge you're going to have as a teacher. All right, enough of the problem. So how do we address it? Well, we don't address it this way. One of the things that people do when they're not comfortable talking before people is they write everything out. The PowerPoint is only supposed to be there to remind you of an outline of your talk so that you have little bullet points to be a sort of a tickler for your memory to say, okay, I need to talk about this. You need to already have an understanding, and this really shouldn't be that hard for you because you live this work. You know how to explain it. I'm always fascinated. I've asked people to write things in the past. They can't do it, but if I sat next to them and asked them a question, they would write me a book. But when it comes to putting it down on a piece of paper, or in this case digitally, they freeze. I mean, I had one gentleman who I wanted him to write a little article on a particular bait technique that he had. And I said, just write it up. He says, well, I don't know how to do it. I said, what do you mean you don't know how to? Just describe it. I don't know what word to start with. And I said the word the. And he said, well, now I need the second word. I mean, it was ridiculous. But if I sat next to him, I know he would write me a book. Right? Just, there's this paranoia. Don't do this. This is awful. Right? So don't have a design like this in your PowerPoint. Even if you're scared, you need to figure out a way so that you don't do this to your audience. Okay? Do not do that. Now, obviously, that's an over-the-top example here, right? But don't do it. The second thing you need to recognize is you need to be cognizant of time. People are distracted. You need to hold their attention, and it's always better to end early than to bore them to death. Okay? So this is something you're going to need to keep in mind. There's an old phrase from Pascal. It's also believed to be said by President Lincoln. He said, sorry for the long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one. I'm reading it for those of you that aren't in the audience, aren't seeing it. I probably should go back to the previous one. The previous slide, for those of you that are driving, is simply text. I took a paragraph off the web, just dumped it on the screen. Hideous. So what's the neuroscience of learning? As we're learning more about how our brains are wired, we're understanding that we can only process so much information at once. So the concept is moving toward is we need to chunk information. That if you simply vomit too much information at people, they're overwhelmed and they can't process it, particularly if it's something new. Now, a lot of people think they understand wildlife control because their grandfather sent a cage trap and therefore they know they put a cage trap in their backyard and caught a squirrel and now they're an expert in trapping. We know that's simply not true, right? But it does mean that when we're trying to explain, sometimes when we know too much about a subject, we think they need to learn it all. When I was working with a particular association about training materials that were being created, I had to constantly repeat the need for basic. Keep it basic. Keep it basic. If you want an advanced class, have an advanced class. But there was always this push, oh, we need to add this. Oh, we need to add this. And I said, no, we need to have it. We need to have a difference between training that gives someone their driver's license and training that brings them to Mario Andretti. I'm obviously dating myself. For someone with more advanced skills, right? So that is what we need to do when we're talking to our audience. So you need to know who your audience is and be sure to chunk it. So if you're dealing with a virgin audience, maybe you're trying to do a marketing campaign at a garden center, you need to be thinking about chunking and keeping that information, keeping it simple. The idea of multitasking is simply a myth. People say, I multitask. No, you don't. What you're able to do is switch between tasks faster than other people can. But you're simply not able to do it. Your brain has only so much attention, and you cannot divide it and look at two things at the same time. You cannot do it. Okay, they've demonstrated that in multiple studies. So what we think is multitasking is simply not. It's just simply fast switching back and forth. So what that means is when we talk about a topic, we need to simplify that topic Don't overcloud. Don't put so much content in your PowerPoint slide that you overwhelm your audience. Simplify it. Keep it simple. If you truly have a grasp of the content, you know how to break it down to its foundational form. If you don't believe this, you should listen to people who are just absolutely brilliant in their field. They have the ability to take extraordinarily complex topics and make a popular book about them while not compromising the accuracy of their material. That takes a level of competence and awareness that very few people have. Now, just because we don't all have that doesn't mean we should not strive to make our material better. Now, on my training materials that I use in my day job and for my business, I am constantly revising those. Even if it's sometimes I'll find a typo, maybe I think the layout is wrong, maybe I have a better photo or a better image or perhaps a better schema to present that material. They're always being tweaked, and each time they get better and better and better, right? Now, that may not be the case for you. You may not have enough opportunity to do that much teaching, but my point is if you follow these principles, you're going to make at least an adequate material, so you're not going to make it suck. Okay, so rule number 1, every PowerPoint slide must have an image. Let images tell your story. It is far easier for people to process than having a lot of text. Secondly, having less text means it helps you avoid reading the text. Notice I have not read the text here. How often do you go to a presentation and someone will put this up on the slide, up on the screen, and they'll say, "Let images tell the story." Why do I need to say it? You're reading it, right? Now, obviously, I would need to say this because those of you that are driving don't know what it says. So the picture that's here is "Let images tell the story." And then I have below that, should you use the word apple written out, or should I just use a picture of an apple, which I have next to it? Which is easier for you to process, the word apple or the picture of an apple? Which one's going to be more memorable to you, apple or the picture of an apple? I think you know the answer to that, right? So make sure you have good quality images. And if you're in business for any length of time and you've taken some good photos, if you followed my presentation on how to take good photos, you should have a wealth of information to visually dazzle your audience to the point where you may not even need to have text on the screen. The pictures may tell the story for you. So the corollary means simplify your text. Now, this is sort of a repeat of what I did before, and that is you shouldn't have all over text. You should use bullets. Simplify. You should have not these long sentences because, one, you don't want to be reading, and secondly, you want to keep the text small because you need to have room for your images. Okay, so use bullet points. You don't have to use complete sentences. This isn't a grammar class, right? You're using it as a tickler to remind you and to reinforce the information you're trying to get to the audience. Use abbreviations. You know, there's a lot of common abbreviations. That reduces the amount of text that's going to be on your screen. The next corollary is you need to be sure your fonts are large enough for the audience in the back to read. So my recommendation is that none of your text should be smaller than 24-point font. Whatever your font that you've chosen, we'll talk about that in a moment, it should be minimum of 24-point. So that means everything else is going to be larger than that. Now, if you're in a more webcast situation, you have a lot more flexibility about that because people can adjust their screens or get closer to the screen. But if you're talking to a live audience, that person back 12 rows of chairs, that's going to be much harder for them to read because they're farther away, right? So you want to make sure your thing is visible because that's another thing. You want to be sure whatever your area where you're speaking, do you know what that situation is like, right? So that's part of another story. You look at the font here. Now on the left, you're going to see that we're using sans serif font. Now some of you may not know what that means. Sans serif means without wings, without these little curly cues at the end of a letter. It's sort of like block lettering, not in the sense of a block like when you're in school, but everything has sharp edges. All your letters have sharp edges. There's no curl to them. So I'm using, I think, an Arial font here to the left because that's a sans serif. Sans means without, and then serif means the sort of wing, okay, without the wing. Notice how the next column that I have here shows you the serif font. Now I'm going to try to put my cursor here. Notice, see that little bulge there on that F? Well, that's the serif, right? Here you have the R. Notice the other bulge there. That's the serif. What's the serif for? Well, when we're reading a book, serif font is believed to help carry the eye better because it has that little extra piece of ink that helps our eye follow along. The sans serif font is often better for things that are going to be like headings and when you're going to be looking at a distance at something because it doesn't blur as easily as serif font does. So it doesn't mean that you should never use serif fonts on your PowerPoints. What it means is you need to be thinking about visual clarity, and as a rule, sans serif fonts are going to be more visually clear, but they get tiring if you have a lot of text in it in a row. So like, that earlier slide where I had just text throughout the whole screen, if I used a sans serif font with that would have been very tiring on your eyes. So if you have a lot of text, you want to use serif. But if you have a very little text, which is what you should be using on your PowerPoint, you probably want to use a serif font. Now, it's a rule of thumb. It can be broken. It just means you want to be sure to be thinking about that. Lastly, you want to minimize your fonts and colors and sizings. Notice what I've done here to the right. I have minimize bold. I'm using another type of font color, font sizing. I do a different color there, and then sizings. You want to minimize all that because you want to be sure that if you're doing something different, you're doing it for the purpose of emphasis. So if you ever decide to bold font, that should be something where you want to go pow right to your audience that this is something important. That's when you're wanting to use something unusual, when you want to draw the audience's attention to something you think is particularly important. But if you're just doing everything bold, then it's all lost. Or you're mixing fonts, you're trying to do this sort of artistic thing here. You want to avoid all that. Keep it simple. Keep it simple. And there's an example what I mean by the serif fonts. Notice I have the arrow, the circles there showing you how the sans serif fonts have that sort of cut where the serif fonts have the little wing on it, and I've highlighted it there. Be consistent. Make sure that your images are conjoined or relate in some way to the text. So notice I have a cat here, the word cat, and then I have a dog next to it. That's not consistent. That can cause your audience to be confused. Make sure that the image matches the words or the words match the image. Okay, so it doesn't have to be identical, but there should be a mutual reinforcement that should make sense. Now, if I was talking about the overall concept of pets, then I might be able to get away with cat and dog here. But again, try to keep things consistent throughout. Don't read. Oh gosh, don't read. It drives me nuts when I'm in a presentation and someone's reading me what's on the PowerPoint. Why is that? Because our eyes are faster than the speaker's mouth. Do not read to your audience. Doesn't mean you never read to them. What it means is that if you're reading every single PowerPoint, you are going to bore them to death because most people are not good public readers. And you're probably not either. Okay? Don't read. Because if you're just going to read the PowerPoint, why are you there? You could have it done on an automatic loop and you could walk out and they can read it for themselves. Okay? So don't do that because I'm kind of passionate about that. Respect time. People are busy. If you've been asked to speak, and typically when you have an hour-long training, typically they only want you speaking 50 minutes because that gives time for some questions. It also, you may get questions sometimes in the talk or at the end of the talk. But you also want to give any follow-up speakers time. I've been in numerous situations where I was placed later in the day and I had to be in a situation where I was making up time because someone couldn't shut up. You know, it's amazing to me how many people out there are closet preachers, right? They just can't seem to shut up because it's a lack of preparation. You notice the quote I said earlier, sorry for the long letter, I didn't have time to write a short one. So how do you do that? Now, certainly if you're new to presentation, this can be very difficult. So let me give you a little advice here. Generally speaking, each slide you should treat as about 1 minute's worth of time. Now, there are going to be exceptions. You may have a situation where you have a series of photos where you're only leaving them up on the screen for about 10 seconds. Okay, then obviously that would change the number. But as a rule of thumb, if you're getting above 50 slides for an hour presentation, you're probably going to go too long because most people, when they talk longer than they think they do. And it's going to take them more time because they're trying to get more, they're packing in too much information. This is an area that I struggle with, okay, because I have to work at it. And so, but I've also been in situations where I've had to move through material faster than I wanted because someone else cut into my time, right? So use it as a remember. You have your intro slide that should be very quick, and then your question slide. So you really have 48 slides for 50 minutes, but you actually have 50 slides. But you're doing the first one quick and the last one quick because that's just going to stay up there. That's your contact information. So you have 48 slides in about 50 minutes. Now, if you know yourself, if you've done this once and you find yourself talking a lot, you need to cut it down maybe to 45 or 40. And then knowing that you're going to be able to linger a little bit more time, or perhaps you think there's going to be a lot more questions from this particular audience. This is where the art of training and teaching is certainly going to be helpful for you in terms of packaging your material. Now you may say, Stephen, I want to have more information. Well, let me provide you with two books here. The one on the left, this one here, Smart Brevity, has a chapter in it that can be very helpful for you. I think it might even have a couple of chapters. I think the whole book is useful. A little too liberal for me, but certainly, nevertheless, they make a lot of good points, and they're about how to communicate with brevity, right? So good stuff there. And then if you want to get down into even more depth that I've only touched the surface on, you'd want to get this book by Stephen Koslin. That's Kosslyn. Stephen, that's spelled the same way mine is, Stephen. Stephen Koslin, published in 2007, called Clear and to the Point, 8 Psychological Principles for Compelling PowerPoint Presentations. Again, I believe he's in Harvard, if memory serves, but his takes sort of a deep dive. It's very accessible. I don't want you to think that this is some sort of PhD thesis here. He reads, he's a psychologist, I believe, and he basically takes that from the scientific literature, from a neuroscience perspective, and then distills all this information down into these 8 psychological principles, gives you plenty of illustrations of what not to do and what to do, and I've highlighted some of them here today. The other book, for those of you who are driving, my apologies, I forgot about you. The other book that's certainly easier, has less material, if you're just looking for, a quick dive into what I've already done here, but a little bit more information. It's called Smart Brevity, and it's written by Jim Van Tassel, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Mike Allen, and Roy Schwartz. Smart Brevity by Jim Van Tassel, Mike Allen, and Roy Schwartz, published in 2022. hardcover, and then Clear and to the Point by Stephen M. Coslin is going to be the more in-depth approach for how to improve your PowerPoints. Now you may say, Stephen, I just ain't got all that much time, but I need help with development of a PowerPoint. Then you can certainly reach out to me. I'd be happy to work with you on this, obviously for a fee. I'm not going to do it for free. But nevertheless, I can certainly work with you and give you some guidance on how to move this forward and actually help construct your PowerPoint. But obviously I would need the resources from you, particularly images, and then everything else we can probably do by email and correspondence. Not as expensive as you might think. So I'm pretty fast with PowerPoint. I really have some really good familiarity with it, but nevertheless, it's something that can be helpful. And then of course the content would be all of yours. So it's an image for your company. It's something to think about. It's also something you can certainly leverage in the future, because some of you, as you get older, may not want to be climbing roofs forever. You may want to be having these for trainings for your people so that someone else is climbing the roof that's a lot younger than you. And so it's something for you to think about. And of course, marketing your company is going to be important as well. Then lastly, of course, this is how you get a hold of me. Again, I'm Stephen Van Tassel, Wildlife Control Consultant. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Tell me some thoughts about this particular show. If you like it, definitely give it some 5 stars. We'd be grateful for that. And of course, if you can give us a review, I would be grateful for that. And then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. But I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts, criticisms, suggestions for future shows. Perhaps you would want to be on the show, or someone who should be. Definitely reach out to me. And there's another book of mine called Being Kind to Animal Pests. Certainly a lot of people think that cage traps are automatically humane, and I explain that they're not. Certainly they have some advantages over other traps, but they also have some disadvantages, and they're not always as humane as people might think. But there are some strategies you can do to make them a more responsible humane, because our goal is to capture the animal, control it, not to make it suffer more than it needs to suffer. Okay, so as many of you know, I'm not an animal rights activist. I'm not even an animal protectionist, but I do believe in responsible use of animals, and that we need to respect the animals that we're interacting with. And if you're in a situation where you don't care about animal suffering anymore, you might need to be thinking about that. That's telling something that's deadening your soul a little bit. But I digress. But nevertheless, reach out to me. Would love to hear from you. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.